Hi, welcome to another virtual edition of our DIY Why Don't You program. This is usually held on the second Monday of any month at the downtown library, but until we can have programs in-house again, it will be exclusively virtual. After we're back in the library, we'll still have a virtual edition each month, so I hope you enjoy watching these. This month, what we're covering is how to make the perfect pie crust. Now, is it the most delicious pie crust? I think so, because it's super basic and really easy, but that's the important part, is how easy it is. When you get a pie crust from the grocery store frozen, yeah, that's really easy, but it's not that tasty. You can actually taste all the preservatives. This pie crust has exactly 4 ingredients. You have flour, vegetable shortening, and salt, and cold water. My water is in the fridge, so I'll be getting that in a second because I want it as cold as I can get it without being ice. Okay, now I have my very cold water. The great thing about a pie crust, a good pie crust, is that it is the perfect delivery system for meals and desserts. You can actually even make, my mom would always make pie crust cookies with the leftover crust from a quiche. She would just roll it out flat and then cut it into wedges, sprinkle some cinnamon and sugar on top and bake it. Delicious, just super simple. So it really is a multifunctional thing to know how to do. Quiche is one of my favorite dishes. It's got protein, veggies, you can pretty much make it anything you want it to be. So that's why I love it. Now I do use vegetable shortening. I know a lot of people like lard in their pie crusts, but I'm vegetarian, so that's not gonna work. Vegetable shortening works great, and it ends up being a really good, sturdy crust. So, like I say, flour, shortening, salt, water, and then the equipment that you'll need is a pastry cutter or a fork. Either one will work. And just in case you don't have a pastry cutter, I'm going to use a fork today, just to demonstrate that that is actually just as easy and effective. You really want your hands to be as cold as they can be too. It's all about keeping the dough nice and cold, and you don't overwork it. Where bread, you want to keep it warm because it keeps that yeast alive, and then you work it and knead it to get the glutenization going. Pie crust is almost exactly the opposite. You want to work it as little as possible, and you want it to be really cool the whole time you're working with it. So let's get started. So, in true Klingon fashion, it is a good day to pie. First, we're going to add our flour. I'm not the neatest baker, just FYI, and I'm not wearing an apron. We'll see what happens. Then, you add your salt. 1 teaspoon of salt, 3 1/4 cups of flour. To that, after you've mixed it in so that the salt is pretty well incorporated in with the rest of the flour, you're going to add 1 cup of vegetable shortening. And I add it a little bit at a time because you want to get it kind of covered. It ends up being almost like little nodules of shortening that are covered with the flour in here. So you just put it in a bit at a time, and you're cutting it into the flour. That's what I call this, is cutting it into the flour. It's probably what a lot of other people call it too. It's not something I made up. I will show you my handy dandy tool. This is really effective when you're working the shortening in because it automatically just really cuts that shortening down and gets it covered with the flour, which is what you want. A bit more. I just kind of smash it around. And you can kind of see that it's clumping up a bit. You're getting those nodules of shortening in here. Some of my favorite memories when I was a kid are baking pies with my dad and my grandma and my mom. Like I say, my mom was the queen of quiche. She made a quiche Lorraine that was great. My personal favorite, as far as quiches go, are spinach, mushroom, and Swiss. I don't think that can be beat. That flavor combination is wonderful. All right, we're almost done adding the shortening. And I hope you can kind of see that you can still see that it's pretty floury, but you just have those little marbles, little balls of shortening that are in there, kind of sticking to that flour, giving it something to bond with here. And now is when it matters that your hands are nice and cool. I mean, mine aren't cold. I ran them under some cold water before I started, but it's a warm day. It's not going to hurt anything. This is really difficult to mess up, which is not to say I've never messed it up, but it's, I would say, 99% effective. If you were to feel this right now, it feels kind of like, just a little globby stuff in here. It's hard to describe, but almost like Play-Doh mixed in with the flour here. The flour itself feels denser now, just because it's coated with the shortening, if that makes sense. Okay. But you want to keep that shortening in solid form as much as possible through this whole thing. And that's why the cold matters. You start with a cup of water, but you might not use it all, or you might use more. It's really one of those things where it just depends on how well it incorporates. The recipe actually calls for 3/4 cups water, but I always start with a cup because I always tend to use about that much. So I'm going to start just drizzling it around here and then giving it a quick stir to start incorporating that water in. I use an all-purpose flour. There's pastry flour out there, but I don't like having to buy something that's specific to a single task. So I don't use bread flour to make bread. I use all-purpose flour. And I don't use pastry flour to make pie crust. I just use all-purpose. It's pretty cheap, and when there's not a quarantine on, it's pretty easy to find too. Okay, so you see that that's coming together now, and actually if I squeeze it, it kind of sticks together a bit, which is great. That's what we want. But we really want as much of that flour to come into it as possible, to turn really doughy and not have a lot of dry flour left over. Oh yeah, that's the stuff right there. And you see I'm doing all of this with a fork. I really won't start working it with my hands until the very last, when I'm making sure it's all together. And you see I ended up using almost all my water already, and that was a cup. This is actually a fun project to do with kids too. If any of you have little ones, letting them ball up the dough is really fun. Okay, so now is when you're going to start working it with your hands. You just want to see where you are on the consistency. You want it to come together like a dough. This is where it's actually turning into a dough. You don't want a lot of loose flour. I see just a little bit down here that I would like to get incorporated a bit more. So I'm going to get just a little bit more water in there. Okay. How am I doing? See that? It's very pliable. Again, not really like a bread dough. Bread dough, after you work it a while, you know that it comes to be pretty firm and satiny. This is a lot doughier, more like clay. Okay. So now that's balling together really well. Now, you're going to let it rest. It's been working awfully hard. Even though you don't overwork it, you do work it, and it needs a rest. Kind of a lazy dough. So I'm going to just take some plastic wrap. And, oh, look at that beautiful ball. Whoop. Okay, I can see I need to incorporate it a bit more. That was good. Better to find that out now. Okay. How are we doing? This isn't as sticky a dough as bread dough either. So when you're working with it with your hands, you actually stay pretty clean. Okay. You know, I think I actually want to add just a bit more water to this. Cold water. Okay. That's the stuff. Now it's going to stay together. Beautiful. Okay. Put it on my plastic wrap. I'm going to wrap it up. And then I'm going to pop it in the refrigerator for 30 minutes at least. You can actually do this overnight. I've used dough that's been resting in the fridge for up to 4 days, and it's still perfectly fine. Don't know that I'd push it beyond that because it kind of starts to discolor and just look unappealing. It's probably still edible, but why use it if it doesn't look great? Okay, we'll be back in 30 minutes. Okay, so it's been 30 minutes and the dough has finished resting. And really all that means is that we're giving it a chance to really cool down, let that shortening glom on to the flour along with the water so that it's really pliable, but it's going to stick together really well now. I've put a little shortening on this paper towel and I'm just going to go ahead and grease up my pie plates because this is the last part of doing pie crust. Got my antique pie tins here. Be pretty liberal with your greasing. Got to get a bit more shortening because you really don't want it to stick to it. You want it to come out nice and clean. And the true test of a good pie crust is if you can actually hold a slice of something in your hand without the crust just falling apart. Okay, now the fun part. Get a little bit of flour and just dust your work area. That's to keep the dough from sticking to your counter. This is my favorite rolling pin for working with pie dough, just because the marble stays nice and cool. Just kind of flour that up so it's not sticky at all. And because we don't want to overwork the dough, you don't want to do the whole thing at once. So I'm actually going to just cut off a portion of my dough right now. Give it a quick smoosh. I'm going to set the rest of this aside. And now I'm going to just start forming it into the shape that I want. And then start rolling it out. And as you roll, you want to kind of change directions so that you don't get a super wonky shape when you're done. Don't want to add too much flour, but you also don't want it sticking to everything. I'm applying a good amount of pressure here. You don't want it paper thin, but you do want it thin enough that it's not real chunky in spots. Rolling is another fun thing for kids to help you with. You want an even depth. You can kind of see how thin that is. That's pretty good. I'm happy with that. Okay, so now I want to make sure I have the right size. The easiest way to do this is to put your pie plate on top of it and see if it overlaps enough to actually account for as big as your pie plate is. I would say this is going to be on the small side for this pie plate, but I may go ahead and use it just so that we can move on. Go ahead and just try to make this a little touch bigger. Okay, see how that looks. Yeah, that ought to do it. Okay. And you just lay it across and let it kind of fall in. See, I would have liked to have done this actually a little bit bigger, because then I'd be able to fold it in. I'd like to be able to do a little fold here. This is fine for an example purpose, but if I was actually really concerned about this, like if I was taking this to a family function, or better yet, a function where people don't have to love me, then I would probably go ahead and fix this. I can show you how to fix it real quick, because there is a cheat. If you take a little bit of dough, have leftover water here, and I'm just gonna moisten that there. You know what? No one would ever be the wiser. Because now, when I fold in the top of my crust here to make a nice ridge, it's it's really not going to be noticeable. So I'm just folding this under the overhang of the dough. I'm folding it under. Fold it under. And then you have your choice of how you want to finish the edge. I usually just do a, because I'm not fancy, I usually just take a fork and kind of press it along the edge. You can also, another quick and easy technique is to just take your finger and just do this around. Easy peasy, and it looks not bad. Now this is a nice crust. I think that's going to do really well. Even with our little patchwork on the edges, it'll be okay. The amount of dough that we made with 3 1/4 cups of flour, the cup of shortening, the cup of water, and teaspoon of salt, that makes enough to do 3 to 4 crusts, to be honest. Now, if you're doing something where you do lattice work on top, of course that's gonna take it down a bit, or a completely covered pie, like an apple pie, that would be something where you might get 2 crusts if you were doing 2 covered pies. But quiche, lemon meringue, pumpkin pie, you could get 3 or 4 from just that amount of dough that we made. All right. Dust my work surface again. See if we can do better with this one. I'm gonna dust the top of it this time, just a bit. I start out kind of light because I want to set the shape as I roll. It looks like it's starting to stick to the counter. I don't know if you can see that there. But because it's starting to do that, I'm just going to lift it up and I'm going to sprinkle flour underneath it before I start rolling again. If that's going to be big enough for this great big one. Oh yeah, might not be too shabby. All right. And that's a good thin crust. Now, again, you kind of have to determine how thick you want your crust. This one wasn't as thin as this one, so I would probably use this for my quiche, just because with so much egg and everything, you really want it to be able to hold up to the weight. This one, I don't know, I think I might use this for something more like an apple pie that doesn't have to support all the weight for picking up and eating with your hands. But my family isn't the only one that eats pumpkin pie and quiche with their hands, right? Just putting that out there. Okay, so let's see how this one does. You see how I can kind of manhandle that and it doesn't fall apart? That is why you let it rest, so that it really comes together and gets really pliable but tough, like a librarian. Okay, so I would do the same thing here. I would just fold it under, trim off any excess, and then do a fancy thing on the side to make it pretty. Then you can blind bake, which means that you're going to put it in an oven at about 400 degrees Fahrenheit for 8 minutes or so, just to let it kind of bake up a little bit, so that when you put your filling in, the bottom is already a bit baked and you won't have to worry about any rawness down there once you're baking your quiche or your pie or whatever. So I'm gonna stop here, and then hopefully I'll have some beautiful finished products for you in just a minute. So my lovely daughter actually made a lemon meringue pie with the pie crust that I built earlier. Maybe. I've never actually cut a meringue pie, believe it or not. I've eaten plenty. Oh boy, this looks fantastic. Okay. Ooh, losing some meringue, but look at that. The crust is holding up. And that's edible. Good job. That's delicious. Okay, so that's the end of the program. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you get something tasty to eat. Let me know in the comments how yours turns out, what you use to fill it, and use the recipes below. Just let me know what you think of this. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next month.